You're Human and You. Written by Mad Max the Black. Chapter 17. The Greatest is Here. Part 3. Pushing aside my weariness, I crawled on top of my opponent, trapping her beneath me. Wrapping my hands around her neck, I squeezed for all I was worth. Her eyes widened as she flailed beneath me, terror on her face as she became the one struggling to breathe. Ignoring her terrified expression, I closed my eyes and stubbornly held on for all I was worth. She scratched at me in a blind panic, her nails raking my flesh as she fought against my death grip. I grunted, ignoring the pain as I focused solely on my hands, trying to keep my grip as tight as possible. Her fist came up and connected with my mouth, yet I still held on. Eventually, her struggling ceased, and I attentively opened my eyes. I looked down and saw her green, lifeless eyes staring up at me, tears still present even in death. Unable to look away, I attempted to hold back the growing feeling in my stomach, but it was too much. Crawling off her still body, I heaved, emptying the contents of my stomach onto the dirt-covered ground. I wiped the bloody bile from my chin before crawling over the discarded shiv, picking it up gingerly in my trembling hand. I shakily got to my feet. It was only then that I noticed the sound of the crowd above me. "Amazing!" Mr. Red yelled above the cheers. "Simply amazing! I don't think any of us saw that ending coming. Somehow, someway, our current champion still remains undefeated." Spitting out a glob of blood, I ignored the sound of the cheers and stomping coming from the crowd. Running my tongue all over my teeth, I frowned slightly. Looking down at the pool of blood, I saw that I just spat out 2 teeth as well. Already he has managed to defeat 4 opponents, and yet he still stands tall, despite the wounds he has sustained. Trying not to watch as they levitated the girl's lifeless body out of the pit, I instead focused on my injuries. I gingerly placed my weight on my leg, only to wince as I felt bone grind against bone. Flinching, I grunted as pain flared in my twisted ankle as well. Fuck. This isn't good at all. But can he survive what we have in store for him next? I heard a cage door open above me, and seconds later a large thud echoed around the pit. The ground beneath my feet vibrated slightly at the impact, causing me to grunt in pain as my broken bones shifted slightly. Now then, let's sit back and watch the bloodshed. I froze as a deep, primal growl came from behind me. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I slowly turned around to face my opponent. I looked over at the human, and my pupils shrank to tiny pinpricks. Now, despite what most ponies here believed, I did not consider myself muscular. Sure, the wrestling matches with Rainbow Dash had added more muscle mass to my frame than I had back on Earth. That, coupled with the fact that my diet in Equestria had stripped me of almost all my excess fat, I looked pretty athletic. I had the body of a runner, or maybe a swimmer. This guy, on the other hand, was a different story entirely. It was like some steroids and testosterone had gotten together and spawned some perverse offspring. This guy had to have muscles on his muscles, and he was huge. I had to crane my neck back just to look at his face. As he towered over me, one part of my consciousness wanted me to shit myself in fear, while another part of me, one that did not understand the severity of the situation, was waiting for him to say something about his technique having been passed down for generations. I felt my stomach drop as I stared up at the muscle-bound juggernaut before me. My eyes drifted to his hip, and I noticed he had an apple branded there. Inside of the core of the apples was the letters SAA, could be seen. This bastard, this brute, belonged to the apple family. How the hell did these ponies kidnap that thing? As I gaped up at him, he stared down at me with cold, gray eyes. Slowly, he brought up one of his hands. My eyes flickered to his fist, and I felt more despair grip me. Gripped tightly in his large, meaty hands was a massive knife. nearly 13 inches long. It gleamed wickedly in the dim light provided by the flickering lanterns hanging from the ceiling above us. My shiv would be next to useless against that thing. Trembling, I stumbled backwards until my back was pressed against the wall of the pit. I could do nothing but stare at the behemoth before me. Unlike my previous opponents, he bore no signs of combat on his body. That either meant that he was a new addition, or that no human before me had been able to severely hurt him. He was alert and well-rested, a fire burning behind his eyes as he glared at me. My entire body was in a tremendous amount of pain, every inch of me screaming out for sweet relief. My muscles burned, pushed past their limits multiple times tonight, and I don't think that they would be able to do it again. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no way I was getting out of this fight alive. The creature roared, the force of his voice shaking the very earth beneath me. Above us, ponies cheered and howled with delight. This was going to be a massive bloodbath, and they knew it. Lifting his arm, the muscular freak reared back before flinging his knife at me. The blade soared through the air like a bullet. Reacting purely on instinct, I dove to the side, nearly avoiding the lethal projectile. The knife missed me by a hair's breadth, instead lodging itself in the wall behind me by at least 5 inches. I looked up, staring at it as it quivered ominously. My opponent quickly approached me with thundering footsteps, the teeth bared. I tried to get to my feet, but my broken leg gave out and I collapsed back to the ground. Reaching the wall, he grabbed the handle of the knife and in one swift movement, effortlessly pulled the blade free. Turning, he brought the blade down to swing at me. I rolled, trying desperately to dodge the strike. My anguished screams filled the warehouse as I failed. The blade carved into me, slicing my chest open. Crimson blood flowed from the wound as I tried in vain to cover the horrific gash with my hand. As I lay there writhing in pain, he knelt down beside me. My breath caught in my throat as one of his massive hands closed around my throat. Instantly, my vision started to fade as I was strangled again. I have not come this far to die now. Feeling around my hand, I felt my fingers wrap around the handle of the shiv. Bringing it up, I plunged it into the beast's hand. Roaring in pain, he released my throat and withdrew his hand. Gasping for breath, I attempted to crawl away from him while he was distracted, but as I tried to roll over onto my stomach, my chest exploded in pain. Crying out, I collapsed back into the ground, unable to move. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw activity around the edge of the pit. I could hear shouts and screams, but I couldn't make out what was being said. None of that mattered, however, as my attention returned to my opponent. Above me, the brute grabbed the hilt of the shiv with his teeth, dealing with it the same way one would take care of a sliver. Spitting the shiv out, he glowered down at me. Without hesitating, he raised his blade into the air and brought it down on my face. Reacting with pure fear, I brought up my arms. I grabbed his fist with my hands, wincing as the last inch of the blade cut into the skin of my thumbs. Locking my arms, I struggled to keep his hand elevated, the blade trembling as it dangled over my face. It was a losing fight, however. I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. After struggling through 4 fights, each one leaving their toll. He didn't have that problem. He was well rested and fresh out of the cage. Not to mention that all of his muscle probably weighed more than me just by itself. Slowly, the blade inched closer to my face. The muscles in my arm screamed as I pushed back, my chest heaving. Leaning in, the creature put his weight into his hand. Instantly, my right arm felt like it was in a vice, being burned by a branding iron. I screamed in pain as I suddenly felt the muscle of my arm tear. The blade instantly descended upon my face. With my inner beast roaring in my ear, I let loose a primal, animalistic scream from deep within my soul. Ignoring my injuries and my body's protest, I pushed against him with all of my might. The knife stopped centimeters from my face, the blade trembling as my arm shook from the strain of holding back the brute's strength. Above us, I heard a shriek echo around the warehouse as someone shouted something unintelligible. And that's when my arms failed me. Slowly, painfully, The blade fell that last centimeter and sunk into my cheek. No! This can't be happening! I could feel the blade enter my skin, slicing the flesh as it sunk deeper and deeper. I fought so hard, did so many horrible things, but in the end, I opened my mouth in a soundless scream as I felt the steel blade hit bone. In the end, I'm just going to die here, alone. Blood ran into my eyes as it poured out of my wound on my cheek. I felt it drip down my face, running down my cheek and through my hair. The beast above me growled as I clenched my teeth together, waiting for the end. A blinding flash of white light filled my vision and an immense heat enveloped me. Something slammed into the side of the behemoth, launching him off of me. I screamed in pain as the knife cut through my skin, leaving a deep gash across my face. Covering my face with my hands, I screamed into the bloodied and destroyed flesh. As I screamed, I felt the last reserves of energy fail me. This is how I die, I thought. My entire body finally shutting down for the last time, as darkness claimed me. I glanced out between my fingers. Something bright was descending into the pit, like an angel from heaven. The last thing I saw before I slipped into the void was a flash of color. A flash of lavender. Twilight Sparkle.
All right, this is it,
Twilight said in a hushed voice. Her guards surrounded her as the group stood outside the doors of the farthest warehouse. An unconscious unicorn lay at Twilight's hooves, a lookout that hadn't been doing a very good job. From inside, he could just barely make out the muffled voice of a stallion, saying something along the lines of sitting back and watching the bloodshed.
Once we breach, use any force necessary to subdue any pony inside,
Twilight hissed at the guards. As one, they nodded silently. Turning her attention up, she locked eyes with Sunny, who was hovering above the group.
I need you to fly in there and look for Max,
Twilight instructed.
Once you found him, alert me immediately.
Sunny didn't say anything. She just nodded, a determined look in her eyes. Turning, Twilight pushed magic down her horn and grabbed the door in her magic. Not the handle, the door itself.
All right, let's do this.
With a snarl, she ripped the door off the warehouse, tossing it over the heads of the guards and into the night. Sunny was through the door, opening in an instant, the guards not a second behind her. As the group stormed into the warehouse, Twilight's eyes took in the inside of the building. In the center of the room sat dozens of crates arranged in a circular pattern, covered with cheering ponies. A large pit had been dug in the middle of the crates, sandbags lining the edge. Cages littered the outside of the ring. 6 of them were empty, but the rest of them were filled with humans. 4 dead humans lay out to the side of the makeshift arena. Twilight's heart skipped a beat at the sight of the mangled corpses, but she quickly saw, to her relief, that Max was not one of them. A roar suddenly filled the warehouse, followed by a cry of pain. Snapping her attention back to the arena, Twilight watched as the guards descended upon the ponies grouped there. Stun spells were fired into the crowd, taking the cheering ponies by surprise. Twilight watched as their eyes widened in fear at the sight of the entire company of the royal guards. Screams could be heard as the ponies began to flee. There were unicorns in the crowd that tried to fight back, but were immediately cut down by the trained guards. Pegasi took to the air in an attempt to escape, but were grounded quickly by wave after wave of armored Pegasi. Sunny hovered near the ceiling, amongst dozens of flickering lanterns. Her eyes roamed the room as she searched for any sign of Max. As Twilight looked around the warehouse, trying desperately to find her human, she heard a shout coming from her left. Turning, she saw a sight that caused her blood to boil. Golden Ingot, weighed down by bags of bits, was trying to slink off to the darkness. Smoke began to rise from the ends of her mane as Twilight snarled at him. Looking back, his eyes widened in terror as he saw the enraged alicorn. Pushing a large amount of magic into her horn, Twilight ripped apart the very fabric of space. She stepped quickly through the gap, closing it behind her before ripping another hole into it again. Emerging from the void, she found herself face to face with the terrified stallion.
Where do you think you're going?
She asked, her voice cold enough to freeze water. Golden looked up at her, his pupils mere dots in his brown eyes. Trembling, he took several steps back.
Well, you see, I...
Twilight didn't even give him time to finish. Channeling her magic, she blasted him point blank in the face. His limp body went flying backwards through the air before crashing to the ground. He rolled several times before coming to a rest several meters away, unconscious. Returning her gaze to the scene around her, Twilight blinked when she saw 3 unicorns, a red stallion and 2 identical gray mares, holding off several guards by themselves. Immediately teleporting over, she joined in the battle.
Shit!
The stallion growled as Twilight appeared.
It's the princess's pet bitch!
His horn lit up and he shot a burst of magic at her. Twilight started to bring up a shield to protect herself, but one of the guards beat her to it. The fire washed over the shimmering blue dome as Twilight fired up her own spell. As the protective shield dropped, she launched her own round of magic into the trio. It caught one of the mares in the chest, and she crumbled to the ground instantly as the spell took hold, causing gravity around her to increase. Her twin shrieked at this, launching a salvo of magic bullets back at Twilight. Blinking out of existence, Twilight reappeared safely several feet away as the magic bullets slammed harmlessly into the ground. Pushing more magic out of her horn, she hit the mare squarely in the horn with a massive stun spell. Her eyes rolled up into her skull as she collapsed on top of her sister. As the rest of the guards slowly approached the remaining stallion, a scream rose above the din of combat, causing several of the guards to pause. Using this to his advantage, the red stallion blasted one of them. The guard's armor protected him from the worst of the spell, but it was still enough to lift him off his hooves. The return fire was enough to send the stallion flying across the room. He slammed into the wall of the warehouse before sliding to the floor, unconscious. Satisfied that none of them would be getting up soon, Twilight turned her attention to another fight nearby. She had only taken 2 steps when she froze, the blood in her veins turning to ice. A loud, beastly scream rent the air, filled with pain and despair. The guttural sound caused her very soul to shiver in fear. She looked around for the source, Sunny's voice shout from her from high above.
Twilight!
She shrieked, the panic and terror clear in her voice. Whipping her head around, Twilight looked up at her. Their eyes met and she was immediately filled with fear. The look on Sunny's face was filled with so much distress that Twilight felt her heart plummet.
Inside the pit!
Sunny shrieked, pointing down with a huff. In an instant, Twilight was at the edge of the pit, staring down into its depths. What she saw caused her heart to stop. Her human, her Max, was at the bottom of the pit. He was trapped beneath another human, one that looked to be made more of muscle than flesh. They were both struggling with a knife, the blade of which was a hair's breadth away from Max's face. As she watched in horror, Max's strength left him as the blade sunk into his flesh. Letting out a wordless howl, Twilight poured a massive amount of magic into her horn. The energy coursed through her entire body as she rose into the air, focusing all of that energy, all of her pain, into a single massive point. She released a monstrous burst of magic. It flew into the pit like a lightning bolt, connecting with the muscled freak of a human. The magic didn't even slow down. It lifted the human up. The burst of magic enveloped his body, and with a flash of light, it slammed him into the wall of the arena, instantly searing his body. As the smoking creature slumped to the ground, Max let loose a scream of pain. Clasping his face in his hands, he howled as he writhed on the ground.
No, no, no!
Twilight cried, tears streaming down her face. Snapping open her wings, she jumped down into the pit. The magic around her horns ceased as she glided down to her human. Landing several feet from Max, she slowly approached him, her breath caught in her throat when she saw the state of his body.
By the Maker?
She breathed, her entire body numb. His body was covered in dirt and blood, countless cuts and scratches adorning his limbs. Blood oozed out of a huge gash in his chest, his ribs clearly visible from the wound. One of his legs was twisted the wrong way, a clear indication of a broken bone. There was a huge bite mark on his arm. The palm of his hand on the same arm was torn to pieces. His face was smashed in, blood dripping from his mouth and broken nose. A long, deep cut ran across his face from one cheek to the other. His long hair was matted to his forehead by blood, streaks of it running down through the brown strands. Bloody tears flowed from his closed eyes. His entire body was lying in a pool of crimson. Tears fell from her face as Twilight gazed down at the body of her human, lying broken at her hooves. She heard Sunnyland behind her, her breath coming in broken sobs. Walking slowly up to Max, Twilight collapsed to her knees, not caring about the blood. His chest barely rose and fell, his breath heavy and ragged. Each one sounded like a death rattle.
Max?
She choked out, placing a hoof tentatively on his chest. There was no response. Pushing her hoof into his chest with slightly more force, she realized she could barely feel his heartbeat. Panicking, Twilight lifted her head, looking to the top of the pit. The guard stood by the rim, all around the edge of the pit.
Medic!
She croaked, tears flowing from her face. Her chest felt tight and she was having trouble breathing. None of the guards moved. They just stood there, staring into the pit with looks of horror on their face. Some of them even looked like they were going to be sick. Sunny collapsed to the ground beside her, her body racked with sorrows as tears streamed down her cheeks.
This is my fault,
she muttered, gazing down at Max's body in shock.
This is my fault. This is my fault. This is all my fault.
Running Hoof gently over the wound in his chest, she stared at it numbly, not really seeing it. Her wings hung limply by her side, feathers dipping into the pool of blood the pair sat in. Turning her attention back to Max, Twilight nuzzled his face, mewing softly.
Please, don't leave me,
she whimpered, her fur becoming matted with tears and blood.
Please, you promised me you wouldn't leave me.
Silence fell as she continued to rub her cheek against his. His breaths were coming in shorter bursts.
Medic!
She crowded again, her wings fluttering. Still, none of the guards moved. They appeared to be in shock. Given the current state of things, she told herself that she shouldn't blame them, but Max was dying and they weren't doing anything.
Medic!
Twilight placed her hoof back on Max's chest. She couldn't even feel his heartbeat anymore. Fear growing, she removed her hoof and placed her ear on his bloody chest, listening intently. There it was, so faint that she could barely hear it. His heart was still beating, still pumping whatever amount of precious blood he had left through his broken body. As long as it was still beating, he was still alive. And as long as it kept beating, he was still with her.
Medic!
It was growing fainter, the time between beats increasing steadily.
No, no, no!
Tearing her ear from his chest, Twilight looked down at him in horror. After he had told her the tale of what happened on the train, as well as his fears, she had promised him that nothing bad was going to happen to him anymore. She had promised him that he was safe. She had promised him that she wouldn't let anything horrible like that happen to him again. Yet here he was, dying in her hoofs. Fresh tears welled up in her eyes. There was nothing she could do. She had used too much magic already. She had no more left to perform even the simplest of healing spells. There was nothing she could do to help her dying human. Clenching her eyes shut, Twilight slammed her hose into the blood-soaked ground. Scratching up her face, she threw her head back and screamed into the night, giving voice to her despair.
Medic!
Man, it really puts into perspective just how fucked the scene looked if a bunch of trained royal guards, obviously in this world it's a little more darker, you know, there's the slave human trade. If a bunch of trained guards looked at the scene and were like, oh, fuck. Especially the description that Twilight gave, it really, you can't really tell from Max's perspective because it's all the pain that's happening here and now. He doesn't really have a chance to worry about all the nicks and gashes he got from the previous fights or the eye slash. But when you put it all like that, it's... The fact he was alive when she got there is a miracle. And we will find out if he makes it through this in one piece in the next chapter. I don't know how to segue to my Patreon, so I'm just going to. Thank you to my wonderful Patreons, my tier 1s, Pony Entertainment, Macario, Lord High, Jason, Hyperlink, Chase the Master, Bounds, Kindness, Last Night Beyond Night and Game, Sword Brother, Mordred, Dreamless, Portal. My tier 2 is Captain Blueshadow, Key The Animated Ghost, DJMX 2000, Elemental Wolf, H1 Wolf, King Padeo 20, Mr. Crazy Deacon, Solar Comet, 212 Trooper, Mackenzie, Micolas, Nocturne, Papa Leonard, Redeemer of Dark Souls, Eclipse, Sword Brother, and Mordred, Artie, Bryant, Rihanna, Dragon Wolf, Steel Spark, Saint Gonk, and Styx. A large thank you to my previous Titan tiers, Dark Guardian, Danish Dash, Maverick, and User 1842. And a big thank you to my current ones, Biss Eclipse and Silent Titan. I appreciate you guys' support so freaking much, and it means a ton to me. That aside, however, this has been Fireheart. Have a wonderful day.